Is the chaos here, the confusion of the messaging, a strategy?
It doesn't strike me as a strategy. It strikes me as a lot of mixed signals based on a new administration that really has not come together to make sure that everybody would be on the same message with regards to national security. And so everybody who comes in has a different view, says something different, and very frankly, it's just not very clear right now just exactly where the United States stands.
We heard again from the Secretary of Defense yesterday, who did clean up some of those remarks, by the way. The reaction was pretty intense on both fronts, and I'd like to go through both of them with you. Let's start with Hegseth. The chair of the Senate Armed Services Committee, Roger Wicker, responding in a conversation with Politico, said he was puzzled and disturbed by the remarks. He said that he don't know who wrote the speech, but it was a rookie mistake in Brussels, the kind of thing Tucker Carlson would have written, and Carlson is a fool. That's a direct quote from the chair of the Senate Armed Services Committee. How are things starting out for this new defense secretary?
Well, when you get those kinds of remarks from the chairman of the Armed Services Committee, it should be a wake-up call with regards to what you decide to say and where you decide to say it. Look, this country has spent an awful lot since World War II. First of all, we fought World War II with our allies to make sure that extremism would never prevail. And we've worked together with our allies since World War II to make sure that, that Russia and Putin would never succeed. And those are somehow, those are the real founding principles that guide us in terms of our national security. And when people are now saying things that create some confusion as to whether the United States still represents a strong leadership position, working with our allies to make sure that we protect freedom in Europe, I think that's cause for concern. So I really do think that the administration has to get its act together better.
Well, I want to fast forward then to today, J.D. Vance, and the messaging that we heard as he opened talks, if we can call it that, with the president of Ukraine. He did sit down behind closed doors with Volodymyr Zelensky, and there are great questions about Vladimir Putin's motivations here as we talk the idea of peace. I spoke earlier today on Bloomberg TV and radio with Melinda Herring of the Atlantic Council and what she had to say about how Putin views this war.
He thinks he's winning. He's still taking territory. It's slow going, but he has momentum, particularly in the Donbass, and there's no reason for him to jump ship. He wants to destroy Ukraine, Joe. That's his goal, and he's doing it slowly but surely. And he's betting that he cares more about Ukraine than the United States or Europe does.
Do you agree with Melinda Herring on that, Secretary, that Vladimir Putin would simply use a ceasefire to regroup?
Well, I think there's real concern about what Putin would do during a ceasefire and whether or not he really is credible and trustworthy with regards to negotiations for peace. Look, Putin is the aggressor here. Putin invaded an independent, sovereign country, Ukraine. And he has not been successful because the United States and our allies in NATO have supported Ukraine in this war. I think it is very important for the United States to make clear that Putin will not succeed in taking over Ukraine, period. That has to be a clear, fundamental statement that Putin will not succeed. And it's an important message to send not just to Putin, it's a message that we need to send to Xi in China. We need to send it to Iran. We need to send it to North Korea, that we will not allow a tyrant to take over a sovereign and independent country. So I really hope that, in terms of any of these negotiations we're talking about, that there is one fundamental principle the United States will not put on the table, and that's that we will do everything necessary to protect an independent and sovereign Ukraine, period. That is a principle the United States cannot give up on.
Yeah. Well, this administration is watching a couple of hot spots right now, and I'm very curious to hear what you think is going to happen tomorrow at noontime, Saturday, in Gaza, as we expect here the release of at least 3 hostages. President Trump has said if the hostages are not released on time, all hell will break out. What do you expect will take place tomorrow? Benjamin Netanyahu is also threatening intense fighting.
Well, there have been a lot of concerns, but Hamas seems to indicate that they will, in fact, release these hostages. I hope that is the case, and that we're able to continue the ceasefire that was put in place. But like everything else, it's really dependent on Hamas and whether Hamas is willing to stick to the terms of the agreement that was arrived at. Look, we've been able to achieve a ceasefire. The hope is that we can continue to work towards a more permanent peace, and that Israel and Hamas and other countries don't have to go back to war. We're looking for a more permanent peace. I hope the administration focuses on the Abraham Accords and really tries to work with moderate Arab countries in the effort to try to produce that more permanent resolution of peace in the Middle East.
I'm afraid we're out of time, sir, but I am curious if we could do a yes or no here. Do you believe that Benjamin Netanyahu wants to reach phase 2 in the ceasefire?
I think if he doesn't want to achieve phase 2, that there will come a moment where he will no longer be head of Israel. His responsibility to Israel is not only to obviously defeat Hamas, but it's to achieve a permanent peace. And that's how he'll be judged as to whether or not he was able to do that.